The other part of the story is, in order that they don't trust God, in order to take matters into their own hands, they have to violate the rights of another human being. And look, the story doesn't tell us whether Abram was harsh or gentle. It doesn't tell us if he asked permission or if there was a conversation. It doesn't tell us whether she was happy about the situation or not. And of course, we have to acknowledge that this story took place in a time when slaves had no rights, they had no protections, social hierarchies were highly stratified, landowning men being at the top, followed by other men, followed by women, then children, then at the bottom, slaves. And in many cultures like this, you had no hope of ever exceeding the boundaries of your social class. And in many cases, slaves were not even considered to be human beings. So to be a female slave was probably one of the lowest positions that you could be in a society like this. If you were a slave, especially if you were a woman, no one listened to you, no one thought of you, no one saw you, unless you could become a means to an end. And that's exactly what happens in this story. Hagar only enters the story when she's useful to our heroes. But somehow it gets worse. So congratulations. This is a fun discussion we're having this morning, isn't it? Everybody's having a great time. It's coming to a good place, I promise. Hagar does get pregnant, which seems to be a good thing at first, right? That's the whole plan. Hagar is supposed to be the one. We're going to have kids through Hagar. Abram's still going to be the father. We're going to fulfill the promise. We're going to build a nation. It's going to be great. Abram gets what he wants. But Hagar, the story has this funny way of telling us that Hagar despises her mistress. And I'm not going to even pretend to dip my toe into what it's like in the dynamics of a family like this, where you have two women, one of whom can't have kids, and the other is the social inferior, and yet she is able to have kids to give. It's a mess. It's a whole mess, right? But Abram, he doesn't get to get off scot-free in this situation because he sees what's going on. He's the boss, for better or for worse. He's the patriarch of the family. And instead of dealing with the problem, instead of working this out, he basically says to Sarai, you just do whatever you think is best in the situation, which is basically him giving her free rein to do what she wants. And the story tells us she does exactly what she wants, which is more abuse to the woman who doesn't have any rights or any protections. And so you'd think, okay, in a situation like this, what's Hagar to do? What is her recourse? What does she have at her disposal? How can she get out of this situation? And the only way that she can get out of this situation is to run. And that's exactly what she does. Let's pick it back up. Your slave is in your hands, verse 6, Abram said, do with her whatever you think best. Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur, in case you want to go and check it out, And then he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Where are you? And then I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man, which is what every expectant mother wants to hear. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. You're probably acting like a wild donkey in the womb right now. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. He will live in his hostility toward all his brothers. Not exactly the nicest thing that you want proclaimed over your unborn child. Verse 13. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi and is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years of age when Abram bore him Ishmael. Okay. Couple of notes. I think the first thing is, if this angel were a therapist, I don't think it's a very good therapist, because I don't think I would counsel somebody who's being abused to return to their abuser. But it's a complicated situation. It's an incredibly complicated situation, and the sad reality is Hagar doesn't have any other options. She's in the desert. She's in the middle of nowhere, and she's a female slave. Where's she going to go? What's she going to do? How is she going to survive? And so, as incomprehensible as it would be for us to advise Hagar, if we were in her situation, what she's been advised to do may be the best solution, as awful as that sounds. But I think the most interesting part of the story, and we could talk about the wild donkey of a man, because that's really fun, but I think the most interesting part of this story is found in verse 13 and 14. Because this, in my understanding, and I could be wrong if somebody wants to let me know, in my understanding, I think this is the only time in the Hebrew Bible where a character gives God a name. Most of the time, God shows up and says, I am such and such. Like when God shows up to Moses, I am who I am. But in this situation, Hagar gives God a name. Now, if you're reading carefully, you might have noticed one small inconsistency. So in verse 7, it says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. But then, she says in verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. So on the one hand, we have an angel speaking to Hagar. On the other, Hagar treats the angel as though the angel is God himself, which kind of sounds weird. But I was reading about this, and it's really fascinating. This is something that shows up time and time again in the Bible, that when God's servants act in his stead, as in an angel, it is as if God himself is inhabiting the being and working through them. We see this just a couple of chapters later on. 3 random men show up to Abram's tent, and they have a conversation. And on the one hand, they are portrayed as just being 3 men, 3 strangers. But the text also treats one of them, though it doesn't specify which one, that is actually God himself. Some traditional readings of Jacob and the angel that he wrestles with treat it on the one hand as an angel, but on the other hand is God, because at the end, Jacob actually says, I have wrestled with God. We also see this, in that story. But so it's interesting. On the one hand, we have an angel. On the other hand, we have God. So it's as if it's not just an angel that meets with Hagar, but God himself. In the case of Hagar, she also gives God a specific name. Now, she gives the name El Roi. Now, when you read this, as it says in verse 14, that is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. That is, if you read that just like in English, it'll say R-O-I, Roy. And most people would pronounce it El Roy, which kind of sounds like a dude from Texas, like Elroy. Brother Elroy, come here. All right, sorry. But in Hebrew, it's pronounced Roi, El Roi, which has been translated a couple of different ways. A couple of different ways that it's translated as the visible God, the God who appears, the all-seeing God, or a really personal one, which is God saw me. God saw me. But most of the time we see it translated as the God who sees. And I really like that one. I like the God who sees or the God who saw me, because I think this really communicates the emotion that's happening in this story. And I think it parallels really well the rationale for why she calls God by this name. And this is the only place that you'll find this name being used in all of the Bible. It's almost like we're getting a window into an incredibly intimate moment between God and this woman, Hagar. This woman, by the way, who is Egyptian. So we don't see Ra show up. We don't see Osiris. We don't see any of the gods that probably she's worshipped her entire life. We see a God who is foreign to her, a foreign God showing up to a foreign slave woman who actually meets her where she is. I think the meaning of El Ra'i is far more multi-layered as well, and here's why. There's a counselor I read, his name's Joshua Hook. He writes a blog, and he writes about a time when he was attending a baseball game. This is in America, obviously. And it relates an experience that he had where he was sitting in the baseball game, and I don't know if if you've ever been to a baseball game, I haven't, but if you've seen on TV, you'll see, what's it called? It is called the Jumbotron. Has anybody ever heard of the Jumbotron? Yeah, it's a weird name. I don't know. Americans, sorry Americans if there are any there. The Jumbotron, it's that random camera that pans around the audience at a baseball game, and then it'll just like focus in, and then it'll be like, Ryan! And then Ryan will like do like a funny gesture. Hilarious. And that's just what it does. That's what it's there for. It's like, maybe for the halftime. I don't know if baseball has a halftime, but to kind of keep the crowd engaged. And you never know, it could be you appearing on the Jumbotron. And he said that it would pan around, and no matter who it settled on, old or young, no matter what ethnicity, anybody who saw themselves on the screen would suddenly go from maybe being a bit bored or disengaged or talking to their neighbor or on their phone to suddenly alive and animated. And why is that? Why is that? He says, I noticed during the game how excited everyone was if they saw themselves on the Jumbotron. They could have been bored, half asleep 1 second before, but once they saw themselves on the Jumbotron, everyone would jump up, wave their hands wildly, and act crazy. Why? Well, it's because no matter how introverted or extroverted you are, no matter your upbringing, your culture, your disposition, doesn't matter. At some point, all of us need to be seen. Whether it's in your job, your family, or to a random crowd of strangers at a baseball game, we all have the need to express ourselves, to make our voices known, and to be recognized and acknowledged by other people. This is a fundamental human need. Now, I want you to imagine that you are a slave, female slave, in an Iron Age era Near Eastern culture. You have no voice, you have no security, you have no recourse, no self-determination. You are at the mercy of your masters, and you can and will be mistreated, abused, and thrown aside if it pleases them. You have no say in the matter. Now imagine how incredible it would be to reach the end of your tether, be completely hopeless, only for the God of all creation to meet you at your lowest point and to say, I see you. Not to mention that this isn't even Hagar's God, as I've already mentioned. This is a foreign God to a foreign woman. And even though this is the only instance in the Bible where El Roi shows up, for me, this is one of the most comforting images of God in all of Scripture. In fact, this message, even though this is an incredibly mature message, this is one of the first messages that I ever share with primary school age kids when I'm doing chaplaincy in schools. Because this is the message that tells kids, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter how bad your home life is, no matter how messed up everything is with your life and your family, there is a God who sees you even when it's at your lowest. And let's face it, the need to be seen is not something that we always get. And this is definitely the case when I was a chaplain. I was a chaplain in a little primary school in New Zealand where we had kids from all walks of life, all different cultures, all different ethnicities, all different social classes. We had kids who were, upper middle class, and we had kids whose parents were in and out of prison, drug addict. And there was such a contrast between the kids who could be seen, could be heard, and the kids who weren't, the kids who just craved to be recognised, who craved to be acknowledged by their peers and by adults. And as you can imagine, it comes out in all sorts of crazy ways. If Karina was here, she'd be able to tell you some interesting stories about some of her old students. It's not always something that we get, and this is true for all of us, no matter where you are. Sometimes we're seen and acknowledged. Look, I'm a pastor. I get to stand up here and talk, and you're all my prisoner, kind of, a little bit. I mean, it is what it is, right? I can say whatever, and you all have to sit there and watch me. Not everybody gets that opportunity. Probably a lot of you are very thankful that you don't have to stand up here and talk like me, and that's great. But we all need to be seen and acknowledged in whatever way that we feel comfortable with. And I think that this is a really apt message for the people in our lives who often don't get seen and don't get acknowledged. That's our mums. How many times have our mums put their needs on hold so that ours could be met? How many times have our mums sacrificed what she loves in order to give her kids what they love? How many times have our mums slaved away in the background, unthanked, unrecognised? How many times have they cooked a meal for an army of teenagers they didn't even know were coming until half an hour beforehand? How many times have they cleaned up the house after a long, hard day's work? How many times have they taken the bins out after asking their husband to do it 3 times already? Definitely hasn't happened to me. How many times have they sacrificed